Have this moment. My name is Phoebe Atkinson, for those of you who I haven't met. I'm a clinical social worker in New York City. I'm also on faculty of the Wellbeing Institute, many different hats. And Caroline and myself have been partnering with the JCC and the Wellbeing Institute for the last couple of months to bring these webinars featuring alumni and friends and faculty of the Wellbeing Institute, bringing the science of positive psychology and resilience to help people during this time. And I'm joined today by Dr. Anthony Zipple, my colleague, who I will be teaching with in the fall on another offering from the Wellbeing Institute. And before Tony introduces himself, I just want to, in the spirit of loving kindness meditation, let's all just hold Caroline in our hearts right now and send her, just beam her all that we've learned so far about the power of micro practices and sending positivity resonance in a loving kindness meditation. May you be safe. May you be happy, even in the midst of this sorrow. May you be well, and may you have ease and peace in these moments as you process this, and know that you're held with so much love as you hold all of us, Caroline, in your exquisite facilitation in your role of director of the wellness program at the JCC. So know that we have your back today, and we are thrilled and delighted to be here. So Tony, how about you introduce yourself, and then we'll take it away and maybe frame our topic, and then we'll put up our slides.
Yeah. Really pleased to be with all of you today. Again, I'm Tony Zipple. I'm a psychologist and a coach and a trainer and a consultant. For most of my career, though, I ran community mental health centers in Boston and Chicago. I'm now based in Louisville, where I ran a large regional community mental health center. So I'm one of those guys who knows just enough clinical stuff to get into trouble and just enough business to get into trouble wherever I go. But really a pleasure to be with you here today, talking about how we take positive psychology lessons and experience from the research and translate it into more traditional clinical uses and maybe some personal uses as well.
So positive psychology is obviously an evidence-based science, and a lot of what we are drawing from was first brought forward in the humanistic era, when people were looking at this actualizing tendency within us, and how do we help people to stay motivated to grow and to develop the best that's within themselves. And as Tony is going to talk about, we're going to frame the field of positive psychology and then talk about the clinical applications, how we work as both individual therapists and trainers of therapists. And so this is not going to be kind of ask your therapist, just to kind of frame our expectations today. We're really going to give you a frame of positive psychology as a lens of understanding clinical practice, and then a few tips that we hope that you'll take with you as resources today. So Tony's going to start us off, and I'm going to be manning the slides. So let me just first bring these up. And Tony, you can just tell me when you're ready to start.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and click on the next one.
Okay.
So when you think about therapy, and lots of us have been in therapy, some of us may be professional therapists, we've watched people in therapy. What's really our goal for therapy? If you could click.
Sure.
In lots of places, therapy is really about symptom control. How do I manage my symptoms and get to baseline? But really, I think therapy ought to be, how do we end up with a life that's filled with happiness and meaning? The next slide. Positive psychology is all about that. It's a way of going beyond just symptoms. This definition from the University of Pennsylvania is one that I like to use. It describes positive psychology as the scientific study of strengths and virtues that enable individuals and communities, because we're all part of a community together, to thrive. It's not just about getting to baseline, it's about thriving. The field is founded on a belief that people want to lead meaningful and fulfilling lives, cultivate what's best within themselves, and enhance their experiences of love, work, and play. comprehensive and positive. And that's really what therapy ought to be about. Next slide. Positive psychology focuses on authentic happiness. Right? What we're trying to do in positive psychology is help people achieve high and consistent levels of positive emotion, to be fully engaged in their own lives and with others, and to achieve a deep personal sense of meaning and purpose for being in the world. Do the next slide. So when I talk about happiness, a lot of people sometimes say, oh, happiness, that's kind of a soft, fluffy thing. Who wants to focus on happiness? But I really think happiness is an important construct. It's really probably the most universal thing in the world. If you ask people what they want out of life, everybody will agree they want a higher level of happiness. But there are also really important scientifically supported reasons that happiness counts, and these are some of them. We know that people who are happier tend to feel better. That goes without saying. But they also have longer life expectancy. They're healthier. They bounce back from adversity faster and have higher levels of resilience. They have better romantic lives. They're able to solve problems faster and find win-win solutions that keep everybody moving along together. They're less likely to be violent and more likely to be compassionate and to love. And they're more likely to help other people. And maybe my favorite reason on this is that people who are happier tend to be luckier. And I think that's because as we develop higher levels of happiness, we can see laterally. We're more mindful and aware of what's going on around us, and we're able to recognize and take advantage of good things that happen in our lives, and it feels like a higher level of luck. All of these are research-supported reasons. Next slide. Now, traditional therapy has tended not to be very focused on happiness. It's focused on symptom control and helping people to improve functioning and reduce crises and return to baseline. When I ran mental health centers, I almost never had anybody who showed up at the center who said, can you help me stay on my medication? They would show up and say, can you help me find more friends and family? Can you help me get a better job? Can you help me find a better place to live? They wanted a better life and they wanted to be happier. That's what really brought them to therapy. The next slide. Just a quick look at the difference between positive psychology and more traditional approaches to abnormal psychology. We're not studying dysfunction and focusing on symptom reduction. We're really trying to help people to achieve happiness and increase their well-being. We want people to flourish, to go beyond their baseline and do extraordinarily well. And we're still focused on studying people when they're at their best and learning from them when they're at their best and helping them to do things that have them at their best more often, as opposed to focusing on people when they're at their worst. Next slide. Well, positive psychology, you'd expect it to be all over the place in therapy, but it's really not, because so much of therapy training is focused on illness and dysfunction. And even reimbursement is focused on illness and dysfunction. Try to go to an insurance company and say, I want to bill for happiness treatment, right? I can bill for depression, but not happiness treatment. There was a study that was done where folks looked at articles in psychology journals and found a 21-to-1 ratio of articles on pathology to articles on positive topics. So we're really focused on negative kinds of things, on dysfunction. And while that's important, we really want to help people with symptoms. Curing illness can be a great goal, but it's not enough. We need better balance, and we need support around helping people to flourish, not just to be okay and get back to baseline. Next slide. The way that we do that is with positive psychotherapy. And positive psychotherapy is introducing what we know about positive psychology into a therapy framework. And the definition of it is increasing positive emotion or engagement, meaning rather than targeting at just symptoms like depression. The core focus is on moving away from what's wrong, and instead, let's focus on what's good and positive. It doesn't ignore the fact that there are psychiatric conditions and symptoms, but the symptoms themselves aren't the focus. We're focused on helping people have better lives and thrive. The next slide. Now, that may seem like a relatively small shift, but it's a really big one. I mean, think about what it's like in your own life if you start to ask questions like, what's working well in your life rather than why are you failing? Or what's going to make you happy rather than what your symptoms are? Or when are you most comfortable and at peace and alert and energized? Then, how can you get more organized and focus on your work? Or what can we learn from the situation that we're in rather than, what went wrong and what are we going to do differently? Those shifts are slight, but they make an enormous difference in our perspective. Next slide. So positive psychology, I think, is a universal toolkit for people with clinical conditions, depression, anxiety, psychosis. They also want more positive emotion, engagement, and meaning in their lives, and positive psychology can help with that. We also know that positive psychology for lots of conditions may be curative. We know that for things like depression and anxiety, that if we can help people move in a positive direction, their clinical conditions often resolve, right? So that it may not be a cure for everything, but it makes life better for everybody. And for some conditions, it really does solve the problems that they're facing and give them a better life going forward. So Phoebe, I think that you pick it up here.
Okay, thank you, Tony. You got through a lot really quickly. And just to bring that to a pause, that it's so important to frame both the distinctions and also the commonalities, because basically in the research, when people are working with a therapist and in a supportive setting, whether it's your doctor or your therapist, you have a relationship. And then each therapist has their own orientation. And our orientation has been really the lens of positive psychology to be informed by the science and the practices, and then to really help the client empower themselves to make choices, to experiment with all these different resources and tools. And Dr. Martin Seligman, who was from Pennsylvania, that Tony referenced in his quote, in 1998, when he was the APA, the American Psychological Association president, he said, let's level the playing field. Let's also let's create a new social science that actually has the focus on people at their best. And that's what we've been talking about during this whole JCC Lunch and Learn series. How do we bring some of these applications to help people start to adopt a lens so they have these resources and tools? This hopefully is a model that you are well familiar with already. This was created by our own Megan McDonough and Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar and Maria Sirois. And we look at each person really as a system. This is a systems approach, the SPIRE model, and it is an interplay of systems. This is a biopsychosocial approach, and this was a term coined a few decades ago up at the University of Rochester, the Medical Center, where they really looked at the biomedical approach, and then how do we actually open it up to a biopsychosocial approach, where we're treating the whole person. We're really considering the social and psychological aspects of a person that is integral to their well-being in addition to the biological causes. So here we have SPIRE, the different elements. And as therapists and as clinicians, we want to support people by first, of course, as we did with Caroline, acknowledging the feelings that anyone is bringing at this time. And then also taking their perspectives, standing in their shoes, if you will, and really trying to understand what's going on for them. And then to offer and explore different choices. And in positive psychology, we have these tools that are evidence-based that we provide and that we help to give information that each one of these elements, that if you have a change, as yesterday Sandy was talking about food and how there's a system of the different kinds of foods that we can, food is medicine, that these foods can really help us. So one change applies to another change, and all of those levels are intersected. So that's what the SPIRE approach is, that every level is a contributor to our illness or our health. So we just want you to think about in our talk today that we're using this dimension of the multiplicity of the different ways that we can help people increase their well-being. And in therapy, we ask, are people working on purpose and meaning, and how to really craft that and create that with them? How can they manage their physical health? I was recently reading in Harvard Business Review that Tony Schwartz, who has written a lot about wellness in corporate America, he is finding in all of his interactions with leaders right now that they're exhausted, they're burnt out, they're irritable. So he's doing a lot of stress management right now during COVID. Can we help people be creative and engaged? And a lot of your speakers on the JCC has talked about the VIA strengths and activating the things that really engage us. So all of these elements are parts of SPIRE. Our relationships, are we nurturing, are we cultivating them, and also with ourselves? And also, how are we feeling emotionally? Are we activating our positive emotions and managing some of the more negative or painful emotions? So this is what we would then look at in psychotherapy with a lens of positive psychology that's successful. Are they activating the SPIRE and in all these dimensions? So then we look at today, this reality that we're in, which is the COVID experience, that there are all kinds of concerns that are being written about and brought forward in the journals and the newspapers every day about the different risks that are now being presented, that we have so much systemic activation, we're not even sure what this is going to look like, but we know in real time there are risks of anxiety, depression. The domestic abuse, unfortunately, has gone up in terms of the hotlines from what's been reported. And then also childhood trauma can get reactivated. And so last week we had Kathy talk about post-traumatic growth. And indeed, positive psychology and resilience practices can help actually ameliorate that childhood trauma becoming actually something more difficult. We can actually work with it, which is what we'll talk about later. But the challenges here are social isolation. Thank goodness there's a lot of teletherapy that's being offered, but still there's limited healthcare availability, and also there's all of these very real economic concerns. So there's also special stressors for professional caregivers that are very, very real. And so we talk a lot about care for the caregiver right now. So I want to stop the slides just for a moment and share with you something that just came to me from one of my colleagues, and it is from Dr. Amy Cuddy. She is a researcher, if you remember the power pose lady that, you know, sometimes Caroline will show us big power poses to help us expand. So Amy Cuddy is also a social psychologist, and she sent out an Instagram. I'm not on Instagram. I guess I should be, but someone was very nice to forward this to me. And she reminded us that actually in crisis management, there's usually 3 phases. There's the emergency phase where we all rally around with an organizing principle. There's a clear goal. So in this case, it was shelter in place, you know, bring down the curve. And then, so we were collectively energized and really focused around this shared set of goals. And this was in the beginning, and we all felt, okay, we're making this, we're intrinsically doing this, this is meaningful for me. And some of our, in this case, our governor was really helping us shape that narrative and have buy-in, because we know when we have alignment with our values, we have more motivation to actually follow through. And then there's the regression stage where we start to realize, wait a minute, and especially now, there's so much uncertainty. And people, because of this stress response, our brain goes into a stress response when we don't have certainty. There's irritation, there's exhaustion. Sometimes people don't know what day it is. You know, there are really important aspects of stress that are happening right now. And people are feeling, again, a lot of external pressures on them, all those real pressures. And then Dr. Cuddy says that because of these stress responses, they're showing lack of productivity, there's a sense of lack of purpose, and all of those physiological stress responses are happening. People can't concentrate. So as clinicians, we always want to remind people that this is normal. We're having a normal reaction to a very abnormal situation. And that is important to normalize, first of all, not to say that this is happyology, to say, oh, don't feel that way. It's all the feelings are absolutely welcome and they're necessary, because each emotion has a function. Actually, it moves us into some kind of action and it informs us. So the following phase is the recovery phase. And now that this is starting to be talked about and really illuminated a little bit a day at a time, that recovery is about reorienting. It's about revision and recalibrating our goals. And it's also about moving into new roles and focusing on moving beyond, not just getting by. It's really looking at, where is my locus of control? We're going to talk about the resilience and how that relates to intrinsic locus of control. And that's really where SPIRE comes in. So I'm going to go back to the slides, but I just wanted to remind us all that we are in crisis mode, and you might recognize that you're either in, the little bit of the regression and feeling kind of like you're, each day is turning into the next. So all of these are very important to normalize in terms of stress responses. So this is where, if I go back to SPIRE, this is really where SPIRE comes in, because we want to normalize and acknowledge that there's a lot of hardship right now, absolutely. And we want to turn to our agency, which is a fancy term for, what we can control. So this is where some of our tools come in. And the power of choice is something that we've talked a lot about in our webinars, that basically we have the need for choice from childhood, right? The most well-adapted kids have the environment where choice is supported. If not, we sometimes get very complacent or rebellious. So it's always that fine line for a caregiver, for a parent, for a leader, for a therapist, for anyone who has a power differential to create the conditions for us to recognize that we are at our best when we're at choice. And what that means is that we have intrinsic motivation when we are aligned with what's important to us. So the power of choice is very much connected to how are we going to shape our days during this time. And that's a lot of the correlation with positive psychology. We want to become proactive versus reactive. We want to look at what are some of the micro practices that we can do to maintain our health, to nourish our relationships, to be able to accomplish some of our tasks before us. So one of our colleagues, Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who has talked for our webinar, in every moment you have a choice. This is one of his most oft quoted, and it's really very pithy and it's profound, because if you think about these moment-to-moment choices, this is really what positive psychology talks about: micro practices, looking at small practices that we can both turn towards what we have control over. And our agency, our sense of resilience is really essential at this time. And that's why we always want to remind everybody about choice. So we had the great fortune of having Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, one of our leaders and our great positive psychology scientists and researchers. And I hope that people that had the pleasure of seeing Dr. Fredrickson also sees how authentic she is and how she lives her positive psychology. She wrote a book called Positivity that really laid out the importance of positive emotions, but this was also built on research that started back in 1998. One of her first articles was, what good are positive emotions? If they had studied things like anger and disgust and shame, they also wanted to look at what good are the positive emotions, such as serenity, gratitude, joy. What kind of emotions, what do they serve? What good are they? So she found in her research that actually these 10 emotions we have most common every day, that they shape our lives. And she actually created a whole theory called the broaden and build theory. And this is what we incorporate implicitly and explicitly as therapists, that we know from her science that actually when we're in a broadening effect of a positive emotion, we actually have our perspective expanded. And this then builds resources. It builds intellectual, physical, social, and psychological resources. So her theory is really contrasted when we're in a negative or a painful emotion. That has a different function. And she saw that the negative emotions actually help us narrow and we get ready for some kind of survival. Whereas the positive emotions, they're pro-social and they're very unique in terms of what they build. So when we're thinking about SPIRE and elevating the positive emotions, these micronutrients that she has shown really help us strengthen our physiology and our capacity to be creative, we also know that we can manage, quote, the negative, the painful. They have also important function, and we can elevate the positive. Dr. Rick Hansen says that bad is stronger than good. So we really need to, first of all, make the case for positive emotions, and that's what Dr. Fredrickson has done. So these positive emotions are these 10 emotions that I'm just going to quickly review. And just remember that in her research, she showed that we have more of these during the day, but because that the negative, painful emotion really get more of our attention, we have to really deliberately prioritize. And what she calls it is prioritizing positivity, to be able to think about what are the activities that when I am in them, I can elevate some of these positive emotions. So when you can recognize the occurrence of them, Dr. Fredrickson says we actually, when we name them, we can be more intentional about actually bringing them in and then taking them in when we are experiencing them. They're fleeting, so we actually really have to be much more intentional. And she suggests that when we are learning about the positive emotions, that we think about the different activities that actually increase the likelihood to bring those forward. And we had Dr. Dan Tomasulo early on in our JCC webinars talk about hope, and he really expanded that right now hope is both two things. It's the fearing the worst, but also hoping for the better, which motivates us into trying to shape what we do have control over. So these are the positive emotions that we work with in psychotherapy, thinking about, you know, when do people experience joy, and we've had Mega Buttenheim on, and Caroline certainly with her Nia. We've had people dancing and, you know, just looking at the joy of study. There is a whole study now on awe, and urban awe is also awe with nature, things that are inspiring. Interest is about curiosity. You know, what are you interested in right now? This is a great time for learning. There's so much that's being offered. And also pride, having a sense of accomplishment. So all of these things are super important when we think of the E of SPIRE, elevating our positivity through actually thinking about and then prioritizing activities that bring these forward. One of the, yes.
If I could add,
sure.
You know, it really puts a fine point on the difference between traditional approaches to helping in psychotherapy and positive psychotherapy. Reducing symptoms of depression isn't the same thing as increasing hope. Reducing anxiety isn't the same thing as pride or love or joy. That what we're really trying to do in positive psychotherapy is not ignore those symptoms like depression and anxiety, but we want to do more than that. We want to help people control those and flourish on the other side of it.
Absolutely. So to really, of course, especially now, meet people where they are and to name and to help them navigate those difficult emotions, as well as to really make the case to expand the possible positive emotions that can help us be resilient. So one of the ones I wanted to feature today, we're going to have next Tuesday a real treat for you. We have Yarrow, who's one of our alumni, and she has created a book of gratitude and gratitude practices. So I'm not going to steal, you know, her thunder there. I just want to really bring forward Dr. Robert Evans' work. He is one of the leading researchers in gratitude. And he says that gratitude is first and foremost a way of seeing that alters our gaze. And Dr. Emmons has actually published so many books, but this little book of gratitude, I must say, is a gem. He says that when our brain is on gratitude, it is fertilizer for the mind. It actually helps us improve its function. And it's not just good medicine, he says, it's a real approach to life. and that it is an honest approach to life, because gratitude is a pro-social emotion, and it has a host of all kinds of things that it brings. But gratitude is something that we can bring at this time. And there's mounting evidence that demonstrates that it really matters in all spheres of our life. So just think about gratitude as a real micronutrient that we can activate. And this is one of the most, I think, featured, very easy to do exercises or applications of gratitude. Just thinking about 3 good things that went well for you yesterday. And you can do it in the morning, you can do it at the end of the day. And he says that you really need to illustrate, what was it about it that went well? And you can think about that even as we consider at this time. And what was the gratitude about? Did you tell anyone about it? When we write our gratitudes down, it kind of organizes, as writing does. And then, so there's this cognitive anchoring. And then when we actually tell someone about it, it activates our emotional, our limbic memory. So we have this wonderful memory that we can keep coming back to. So these are small micro practices that illuminate gratitude. Dr. Emmons actually really talks about, in adversity, what good is gratitude? Again, always trying to make the case as researchers, because these things can seem so fleeting. But again, in the resilience studies, he's showing that gratitude, again, broaden and build, can help us open up to see a bigger picture, and it can motivate us, because positive emotions and motivation are correlated. So when we cultivate these attitudes of gratitudes, if you will, it helps us. So even thinking about and writing and reflecting, even now during this time, and people are going out every night at 7 and they're cheering for people that are on the front lines. They're grateful for them. Again, it's a pro-social emotion. It bonds us to each other. And then also when you think about adversity or difficult times, what are some of the strengths that you've had to tap into? And also, what has this event made you better able to meet the challenge of the future? This is a key part of resilience. We look at what we've overcome. So all of that work on this gratitude, these practices, can really open up the part of gratitude that Dr. Emmons has really talked about, that it's the most actually researched emotion, and it is really the mother of all virtues, as they say. And then this is the last gratitude intervention. Very, very simple. Something I'm grateful for, someone I'm grateful for, or an event I'm grateful for. And the research shows that if you write down something every day for 5 things you're grateful for or thankful for, it becomes a resource and also a tremendous bonding of your event with this other person. So again, it's a lens and it's a fortifier, and it's very important to help us shift and soften as we're going through difficult times. And I'm going to save the rest of the gratitude for Yarrow next week, who's really going to help us understand that gratitude doesn't only help us feel good, but it also helps us to do good, as Robert Emmons says. So Tony, you're going to tell us a little bit about how we can use these reframes.
Yeah, and as I listen to Phoebe go through this, one of the things I always think about is how probably not very many of us had mothers who were neuropsychologists. I certainly didn't, but probably a lot of us had mothers who really understood this stuff well and talked to us about the importance of choice, talked to us about the importance of gratitude. These are things that we've supported through research in psychology, but they're also deep philosophical and cultural constructs, very spiritual constructs that have long and deep roots and make great intuitive sense. And I always say it's wonderful that we now have deep research that supports the importance of these. Now, I want to talk about just one more concept in this, and that's, how do you tell yourself a better story? Next slide. There's a quip in psychology and therapy that says it's not the things that happen to us that make us unhappy, it's the stories we tell ourselves about the things that happen to us. And there's a lot of truth in that. If we could do the next slide. This is a wonderful example of it, right? It's newscasters, and you have one newscaster saying, it's chaos, the situation is tense, roads are blocked, people are desperate, it's been 24 hours and aid still hasn't come to people who need it. And that's probably really true. You have the other newscaster who's saying, amidst the destruction, survivors and local organizations are working to reach the victims. They're clearing roads and setting up communication points so that aids can get through. That story is also true. But depending on which story you pay attention to, you're going to walk away with it with very different feelings and probably with different motivations about how you're going to act in the face of events. It's the stories we tell ourselves about things that make a difference in how we feel about them and in the actions that we take in response to those events. Next slide. Here's an example of it. So you've got a kid who's in school and they have a stressful event. The teacher yells at them, tells them to sit down and be quiet. You know, sometimes kids have automatic stories that triggers. They don't even think about it. That first automatic reaction is the teacher hates me. That's why I got a bad grade. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to fail. It's hopeless. They don't ponder that. They don't slow down. It happens automatically. And that's because they may have very deeply held beliefs about their level of worth and about their struggles in class. These chains of thinking happen almost instantly. But when that happens, they may feel shame and guilt and anger and hopelessness, and that has consequences in what they do next. They may not study as much. They may misbehave more. They may find themselves hooking up with kids who are having even more problems than they have. So that chain of event, automatic negative stories based on deeply held beliefs, emotional consequences, and then things that we do in response to it, that's a chain that happens instantly. And the question is, can we slow down those automatic stories, examine the evidence, and actually make a choice? The point that Phoebe was making earlier about choice is so important. We always have a choice about what we're going to do in response to adverse events if we can slow down enough to watch it and make the choice. So in this case, if this young person slowed down and examined the evidence, they could ask themselves, you know, what are the reasons that this happened? Is it because I don't have any patience? Well, it's true, I get distracted at times, but you know, I'm usually a pretty good listener. Is it because I've got a teacher who's just very forthright and speaks their mind? It's like, well, yeah, you know, I've got a teacher who runs a tight ship. You know, it's nice to have a strong teacher who keeps control of the class. They could ask themselves, am I just on edge today? Well, you know, that may be closer. You know, I've got some problems going on at home and I haven't talked to people about it. Maybe I'm feeling pressured by that. You know, or maybe it's because the teacher was uneasy with me because my behavior wasn't so great. Depending on the slowdown that you make and the examination of the evidence and the choice you make about how you interpret events, you can choose then behaviors that may be more productive. You know, does the person going to focus more? Are they going to listen more closely? Are they going to talk to someone about problems they're having at home? Do they apologize to the teacher for acting out a little bit? So if we can get control of that chain of automatic thinking that occurs in response to events, we can tell ourselves a better story. And it's not that I want people to tell themselves, you know, kind of a Pollyanna story about everything is okay and going to be wonderful. It's not that you want to tell yourself a story that's untrue. You want to tell yourself an absolutely true story, but you also want to be a story that helps you to move forward and take positive events. And you have choices about that. Can we do the next slide? So better stories, when we tell themselves to us, they help us to thrive and do better. You know, and it's a process that takes some practice. It's a process that takes a little discipline to do. The exercise around gratitude is a great exercise for gratitude, but it's also a great exercise for how we take time to slow our thinking down a little bit so we don't rush through that split-second adverse event to I'm a rotten person, to nothing will fix this and I'm just stuck. Instead, we slow down and examine what really happened and what am I thinking about it? What's the evidence for what I'm thinking about it? What are alternative ways to think about it? What's the choice I want to make about how I perceive and feel about this situation, and most importantly, what are the implications of that choice and how I'm going to behave? What am I going to do next, and then next, and then next? Better stories help us thrive. The next slide. An exercise that I like to use with this, and this, by the way, is also an exercise that you can do around identifying strengths. You know, we've talked earlier about positive psychology as being strength focused, and part of that is helping people to identify strengths. But you can also use those kinds of interventions to help people slow down and make choices. This is an exercise called Me at My Best, where you think about a period in your life when you were really doing well and you felt strong and happy and in charge of your life. And for 15 minutes, you just write about that. And you be very specific and you use value-based words. It's really stream of consciousness. No one else ever sees it. Don't worry about spelling and grammar. And then take a look at what you wrote and see if there's strengths in it that you see, and see if there are things in it that you identify that you could use today in the face of adverse events that changes your thinking about what's really going on, that changes your thinking about what's happening and why, and the choices you have about how you can feel about it and respond to that. If you do that every day for the next 2 weeks, you know, you can write about different periods of your life when you were feeling good, or the same period over and over again. But if you put pen to paper every day for 15 minutes over a period of a couple of weeks, you'll find yourself better able to slow down a little bit in the face of adverse events and think a little bit in the moment about what's really going on and the choices that you have for responding to it. And there's tremendous power in recognizing that you have choice. Just that in itself is really healing. And when you combine that impact of recognizing you have choice with actually making decisions about how you think about things and feel about things and what you do next in a way that's more productive and makes you feel better and lead you down a different path, you'll be amazed at the difference that that kind of slowing down, examining evidence, and making choices can make in your life in the face of adverse events. Oh, Phoebe?
Thank you, Tony. You know, one of the things that positive psychology does a lot is focus on the importance of narrative and the stories that we're telling ourselves and how we're interpreting things and how we make sense of things. And this is called coherence. And it really makes a big difference when we can write with that lens of looking back at times when we have had overcome hardship, and then what were the strengths we tapped into. And we know from the strengths work that a lot of our practitioners and facilitators have talked about the strengths. When we name a strength, like naming a positive emotion, it starts to become much more available to us, and we start to recognize it, and that becomes self-reinforcing. So what we're really talking about is resilience. All of these practices go hand in hand with the resilience studies. Remember that positive psychology was based on, we want to create these empirical body of knowledge that can help us to understand how we can be at our best. So Dr. Karen Revich, who was a student of Dr. Martin Seligman at UPenn, created the resilience program, and she came up in her book, The Resilience Factors, 7 resilience factors that people can grow and develop and cultivate. And one of the exercises she has people do is to look back, as Tony was saying, when they were at their best, when they overcame hardship. How did they grow through that? And again, last week, Kathy was talking about post-traumatic growth. So resilience is not only the ability to bounce back, but it's also to grow from challenges. So if we have that mindset right now, that even through this difficulty, we can grow this strength, we can cultivate these factors, and we can also learn and grow as we're going, it is a very powerful self-reinforcing perception that will help to keep us motivated. So resilience is a basic strength that Dr. Revich says, and it is in terms of all the positive characteristics, it's actually the bedrock, she says, of all of the emotional and psychological makeup that we have. That resilience is built into us, And so today we've talked about, slowing down and taking in the good of positive emotions, really savoring them, slowing down and reframing the story that Tony just walked us through, how to reinterpret, how to actually look through what you've been through. And then we're looking at resilience, that this is all about a toolkit that you can create. And here is kind of that all together, that in a clinical approach that has a lens of positive psychology, we're looking at strengths, like what's strong versus what's wrong. We're looking at choice, that sense of self-determination, what we can choose to, what is within our locus of control to change. So what you can change, choosing how to go forward right now during this time. Thinking about where we are in this crisis. If we have a goal that we can work towards, even a micro goal, it helps us to be more self-regulated, which is one of the resilience factors. Bouncing with and learning from adversity. Again, can we continue to look at what we're learning, how we're growing, and increased awareness and appreciation. That's that lens of gratitude, as well as self-awareness, which is one of the key essential ingredients to resilience. Knowing yourself, knowing what's important to you, and then aligning your choices around those values. And then the last is being connected to your own life and others around you. So the number one indicator of resilience and well-being is obviously our relationships, and being able to recognize that we are in a web of relationships, that we need each other, and we can really actively cultivate these things. So we wanted to leave you with, what is one thing that you will choose to do today to improve your resilience and well-being? And we'd like to ask you about that, and just have some time off the slides now and just interact with people a little bit more. So typing in, I have not been able to see the chats at all, Caroline and Tony, since I was running the slides. So wondering if anyone has something that they would like to take from today. We put out a lot of different tools, a lot of different resilient factors, lenses, mindsets. So if you want to type in something, or Caroline, if there's been something that's popped in from the chat.
Sure. I guess I had one question, and that is for both of you, or either one of you could answer. In relationship to dreaming, right? It seems like positive psychotherapy would also be very useful. Like, I've heard a lot of people say, I don't know what I want to do next in my life, or I don't know how to dream.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How can you take us one step further to talk about that in relationship to flourishing, and also from, you're stabilized now, you're looking at flourishing,
yes.
But then it's
sure.
also, go ahead.
Yes. So Tony, I'll start, and then you can take, if you think about broaden and build and positive emotions, it's very hard to vision and to dream if you're not in a positive emotion. So broaden and build, you want to try to get yourself into some of those, that neurochemistry, if you will. So, whether it's going for a walk or exercising or thinking about a time that you've been at your best, any of these interventions, you first want to get yourself into that broadening mindset. The research that Tony was just showing, the Me at My Best story, which is a strengths intervention, is also connected to the best possible future self intervention, where you actually put yourself into the future and you start to imagine. And when we are visioning, which is really prospection, we're activating this wonderful imagination that we have, that we will deliberately use that if you're working with a coach, or if you're working with someone who has you do that kind of a prompt. So visioning, prospecting into the future. Remember, positive psychology is really based on hope, optimism, and future-mindedness. And how do we activate that hope circuitry in a really deliberate and proactive way? So it is an exercise. These are activities that are part of the repertoire of positive psychology to help us to dream again, to make some micro goals for ourselves into the future, or even, a future out, a year from now, 3 years from now. So Tony, anything else you'd say to that?
I think that some of the work around how do you slow down and make a choice plays into this really strongly. And some of the exercises around journaling on a regular basis are really helpful with this. So often when people struggle with, I have trouble dreaming of a better future for myself, I have trouble moving forward, it's because they're stuck in a cycle of hopelessness and helplessness. And I can't do anything and everything is broken and I'm broken and worthless. If you can help people to slow down and focus on their lives when they're at their best, when you can help them to focus on alternative stories about what's going on, and when you can help them to build courage about stepping forward in the face of stresses and struggles, then the broadening that Phoebe is talking about becomes really a marvelous thing to watch. And so there are lots of interventions you can use in positive psychology, but they all seem to feel like, let me slow down, let me consider this, let me think of some things that I can do that support me, that give me more meaning, more positive emotion, more connection. And that as I do those things, more doors open. And as more doors open, I see more opportunities for meaning and positive emotion and connection. And you begin to get people into an upward spiral.
And Tony, one of our colleagues, Dr. Dan Tomasulo, talks about these different interventions as kind of we're time travelers, that sometimes we look in the past, sometimes we have these interventions in the present to inspire the present, and then sometimes we look into the future. So when we think about this time of recalibrating and looking at all the different possibilities, these are great exercises to do. And sometimes it can be start with an assessment of looking at things that are most important at this time, and then how do you actually build on those. And also we want to say that it's Tony was saying it's not Pollyanna, it's not happyology. You know, grounded optimism is saying these are difficult times, and within this, there are opportunities. And if I can focus on what I can control, which is to vision how Rick Prater was talking about designing the day, you know, how can I shape my day? How can I look at these different aspects of Spire and have some goals for myself, whether they're micro goals, that's a vision, you know, that's dreaming, you know, whether it's how I want to spend my week or what I want to grow into, you know, the kind of characteristics or strengths that I want to really illuminate and strengthen at this time.
I love that you both were talking about journaling. And I know that I've had friends say, you know, sometimes I just write down all my negative thoughts in those journals. Those don't seem to help me at all. So can you talk a little bit? I don't think you're talking about that kind of journaling.
No, you know, it's not that it's bad to write about things that are going wrong in your life. I mean, there's some catharsis involved in that, and it's not that it's a bad thing. But you want to use it as a springboard for focusing on things that are more positive, on choices that you can make for moving forward, on identifying opportunities in your life to feel better and do better. As Phoebe was saying, one of the challenges that we have is that negative emotions are like Velcro, right? They happen and they stick and we ruminate about them and they're hard to let go of. You have to work at putting out the positive emotions, and there are usually more positive events and positive feelings every day in your life than negative ones, but they slip away. It's like they're on Teflon. And so journaling is a way of slowing down again and identifying those positive things, catching them before they slip away, as opposed to just ruminating about the bad ones. So you don't want to ignore the bad ones, but they're not the focus. The focus is, you know, what's working right and how do I make a choice going forward? I often think about Jim Stockdale, who was the highest ranking officer during the Vietnam War, who spent a very long period of time in a Vietnamese prison. And people would ask him how he got along and survived with that. And he said the challenge with it is to do two things. On one hand, you always have to be acutely, courageously aware of the situation you're in. You've got to be able to look at your reality in an unflinching way. And you also have to have unflinching optimism that you can do some things that make it better, that you have a path forward. And that's the thing about journaling that's important. You're not just focusing on the obstacles, it's that unflinching optimism that you have a path forward and all of the supporting feelings and activities and events that give you support for your belief, evidence for the belief that you can do better.
And we're really talking about, when we talk about positive emotions and some of these things, that inherently the pleasure principle, the positivity is very important, and meaning, right? That's the other part of this. And what we're talking about is telling a better story, which is making meaning and making sense out of where we've been and where we want to go. So I think that the narration and the writing really helps us to formulate and organize. And a lot of these interventions in positive psychology, some of what Tony was talking about, are cognitive behavioral interventions that are really helping us to look at our thoughts and intervene on the automaticity, you know, these default thoughts, and how do we keep upgrading them and telling a story that's actually more coherent, more accurate. A lot of the work was done by James Pennebaker. He wrote a book called Opening Up, and people wrote about their worst traumas for 4 days in a row. And over time, they started to make sense of not digging down into the downward spiral, but they started to actually have coherence. I'm beginning to understand. Now I see that. If any of this is true, how do I take that forward? So our brain is always trying to make sense and then move forward. Most of what we're doing in therapy is trying to help people really find their positive motivation. And that's about needs, our needs for choice, our needs for contribution, and our needs for connection with each other.
It strikes me that positive psychology is kind of taking this brain that's primitive brain, right? This brain that's been around for a long time, and using the knowledge that we have of science to actually get it to work for us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good insight. You know, it's a way, you know, not of inventing all kinds of new things that nobody had ever remotely thought of before, but how do we put together a collection, a package of tools that we can use that we know really work because we've got research evidence that say they work. How can we put together a collection of things that really work for us and organize it and present it in a way that it's accessible to all of us?
And it's the snowflake too, the snowflake idea that Dan Lerner was talking about, that we're all individual and we're all unique. So personal choice, to close with our session today, personal choice seems to make a big difference. Would you say that's true, Phoebe?
Absolutely. So the idea is that here are all these tools, these research-based, evidence-based practices and activities. They actually call them interventions for each person to experiment. And then to make it your own. So it's not a cookie cutter at all. These are things that then people use and then also adapt. Certainly this science is iterative, so it continues to expand. And Tony, I think we have one more slide also, so maybe you want to speak to that and I'll put it up.
Yeah, I don't even put the slide out. That's okay. That's okay.
Okay.
You know, Phoebe and I are going to be doing in the fall an 8-session series on positive psychotherapy. How do we take what we've learned from positive psychology and use it in professional helping situations? So it's sort of aimed not just towards therapists, but towards professional helpers. Teachers, case managers, counselors, coaches would all find value in this. So the Wellbeing Institute is the host for this. We're going to start in September and have a series of 8 sessions focused on a deeper dive into some of these tools and a number of others besides that you can use in professional helping relationships. And in the slide deck that we'll make available to everybody, you'll see the link for it. But if you look at the Wellbeing Institute, you'll be able to find it up on the webpage now.
And, you know, Tony and I usually as clinicians are listening more than talking. So I'm aware, you know, that we just gave you a lot from our practice. And I hope that some of this is of value in terms of your resilience factors. And we wish you well. And just remember, the takeaway is full range of feelings, and then change what you can.
And thanks for being with us. You know, this is the first time Phoebe and I have presented together. Right? We've
wow,
been
what a
while
treat.
Getting ready for fall. But it's our first run together as a duo. So thank you all for being with us for that.
Yes, well, thank you for making this your maiden voyage. Folks, if you're interested in the certificate for positive psychology in that program, we've been talking about that. I think there's a few days left. Phoebe, is that correct? to sign up?
They can go to
I'm going to put that in the
Wellbeing.
chat. Alan Brown is back tomorrow. I put that in the chat so you can sign up for that. And also, we have this special offering on Thursday. Shavuos is a Jewish holiday that we're going to celebrate. And Maria Serwa and how do I say Elijah? Am I saying his name correctly?
Goldstein.
Goldstein will be
And
here.
Harry Potter, I saw, was coming.
Yes, it's going to be this. So I'll put put those in the chat as well. Any final words that you have to say?
Well, it's just been a pleasure, and these are really tough times. You know, you and I started curating this JCC Lunch and Learn a while ago, Caroline, with Megan McDonough, and it really is the gift that keeps on giving. So it was my great honor to be a voice today to add to the toolkit.
And just you'll see in the chat, there's the Tikkun, and here's the lectures. I'm just copying and pasting as quickly as I can. Tony, it was so nice to meet you, and thank you everyone for holding me as I mourned the loss of a dear friend and student and JCC member, Fred Lieber. We remember him today. He was an amazing man and an amazing spirit. And I'm going to unmute everybody so that you can go ahead and say thank you to Phoebe. And
thank you so much.
so please join us. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. It's always inspirational.
Thank you.